Hello everyone, I'm bringing you a video today talking about this. This is a relatively recently arrived item, one I'm very happy to have, and I want to say a massive thank you again to Crispy and Barlow who gifted me this. It's quite a rare item of uniform and one I'm very keen to add to the collection for quite some time, and he very kindly sent me this one, and it's in quite worn condition, but I like it from that point of view. It's in some use and it's an interesting bit of kit. It's a DPM version of Canada's combat shirt coat, the shirt coat from the Canadian combat uniform. So in the mid-1970s, Canada decided to experiment with a DPM version of the by then standard combat uniform, and this is basically a version of the Mark II combat shirt coat with some modifications. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we look at this in more detail, of course. Made in what is effectively British DPM print. It's made of the same material as the olive drab combat uniform, which is a nylon cotton mix, as I remember, but it's made in the British, what is effectively British DPM. It's a real shame Canada didn't proceed with this. They didn't in the end after trialling the uniform, and it did see quite extensive use for a time on a large scale trials basis, and was essentially set to be introduced, what I understand. But then the decision was taken to stick with the olive drab uniform, and of course Canada wouldn't get a standard issue camouflage uniform, and then until the introduction of CADPAT. So quite a long time wearing the olive drab uniform when a lot of other armies were switching to a camouflage uniform. From a collector's point of view, it's a real shame Canada didn't introduce this. It would be nice for these to be around in greater numbers. And I think a shame for Canada as well. It was a good camouflage pattern and would have been a good camouflage uniform. So it's a shame for the prospective Canadian Army that the camouflage wasn't adopted for general use at that time. But the uniforms have been made in quite large numbers for this large-scale issuing on a trials basis, and they were then given, a large proportion of them were given to Tanzania for use by Tanzanian forces, and they saw extensive use out there in Tanzania. So quite an interesting story from that point of view, a trials uniform made in enough numbers to actually gift to another country, and as far as I'm aware they were gifted as aid as opposed to being purchased. I believe they were gifted as aid to Tanzania, and they were used extensively there. So as I say, quite an interesting story behind this. We're going to look at this in some detail now and take you through the various details. It is basically, as I say, with some minor variations. Externally, it looks very much like the standard second pattern, the Mark II shirt coat in official nomenclature, which is basically the lightweight combat jacket, which we've seen in olive drab on the channel previously. So, in common with that olive drab combat uniform, this has some sort of slightly eccentric Canadian features. For example, the chest pockets here, which are each designed to take one C1 magazine, so the 20-round box magazine, basically the FNFAL magazine. Each of these pockets will take one of those. In the standard shirt coat, the lower pockets have loops in them to carry more magazines. This was the Canadian doctrine based on the 1964 pattern equipment, the idea being you carry the ammunition in the coat, the pockets of the coat, rather than in the web equipment. And so the combat uniform, which was sort of introduced alongside 1964 pattern, at least that was the intention, was designed with that in mind, of carrying ammunition in the pockets. And even when later web equipment, and obviously that doctrine changed, later web equipment was introduced with ammunition pouches, this design lingered on in that the pockets were shaped and sized to take those magazines. So we have that feature carried across here. On the standard shirt coat, as I mentioned, I slightly sidetracked there, there would be loops. In this, there are no loops for magazines in the lower pockets. I believe there were several different iterations of this trials uniform, so it's possible other examples of these did have the loops. This particular example doesn't have those in the lower pockets. It's possible they've been removed, but I've not really seen any evidence of that. So the chest pockets there, two lower pockets there. Closes down the front with small Canadian type buttons, and these are the ones with a slot and a loop of fabric to attach them, which are quite commonly used on all sorts of military clothing these days. And then the pockets have a larger version of those buttons, we can see there. I've actually made a video talking about these buttons specifically because they're an interesting element of Canadian uniform, dating back essentially to the battle dress buttons. They're an adaptation of Canadian battle dress buttons, and they are now quite prolific when it comes to privately purchased military kit, and various other countries use these on their uniforms as well. Notably Britain, of course, with the Soldier 95 uniform, introduced this type of button to British service as well. So quite influential design from that point of view, hence why I made the video talking about them in detail. The print you can see here, as I say, is essentially a version of British DPM in the same sort of colour set. You can see here a typical thing with this when they fade, and this is true of British uniform as well, is when the black colour fades, it goes an almost slightly greyish purplish colour, and this is quite heavily faded, but that's typical of DPM. When it's washed and washed and washed, you end up with the fading of the colours as we have here. At the waist we have a draw cord in common with the standard shirt coat in OD. In common with sort of 70s and 80s manufactured shirt coats, you have the draw cord coming round in line with this middle button here, which means that you can loop, and thanks to those who advised on this previously, you can loop the draw cord back through the buttonhole and actually hide the knot out of the way behind there, which makes this a lot smarter. Later examples made in the 90s actually move the buttons slightly up or down, I can't remember which means it no longer lines up, which is slightly annoying. So, as I say, other than the camouflage print externally, this is very similar or identical to Mark II olive drab shirt coat, but without the loops in the lower pockets, as already mentioned. And you don't have quite the same amount of the nylon lining in the pockets at the top here as well. I believe that the nylon lining is not quite as extensive. On the Mark II shirt coat in olive drab, the pockets tend to be fully lined down the front to strengthen them for carrying magazines, and that's not present on here. Moving this around to look at the right hand side, you can see we do have epaulettes up on the shoulder here in common with the shirt coat in olive drab, so that's again just carried across from the other design, and the cuffs are basically the same design as well, with a single button and buttonhole there. These can be opened nice and wide for rolling the sleeve up if required, as you can see there. So you can see on the inside here we still have the fading, this just from being washed, it's not sun fading. You see even where this is not exposed to the sun. Perhaps this would be exposed to the sun, of course, if these were routinely rolled up, but nevertheless it appears this is faded evenly from washing as opposed to any sun damage. So you can see that there, and obviously the cuff just buttons closed like that. There's no gusset or anything, just an open slot at the cuff there, as you can see. Looking at the back here, you can see we do have a yoke over the shoulder there. We turn the collar up, you can see details of how that's attached there. Just simple seam around the top there where that's attached on. And you can see details of construction down the back here. Darts let in here to draw the waist in, and then you have the draw cord, the waist draw cord coming around there. There is one down at the bottom as well, just to mention that there. Obviously we'll see more details of these when we turn this inside out as well, but you can see the draw cord running around at the waist there. There's nothing new to see on the left hand side here. It's basically a mirror image of what we saw on the right hand side, so we'll turn this inside out now and have a look at the internal details. Looking at the internal details of the front of this, you can see the bleed through of the print on the cloth. It's a fairly thin cloth, and the camouflage print bleeds through extensively, as you can see here. You can see the channel for the draw cord worked in around the waist there, and this is obviously made of DPM material as well, as you can see. There's no label in this as far as I can see, unfortunately, to see any details, but we'll have a look at the internal details of construction nonetheless. At the bottom here, it's the hem is double back on itself to form that draw cord, and you can see the eyelet for that there. And you have obviously the double layer of cloth here where the buttons attach through. You can see that there. And then on this side, of course, we have a double layer of cloth where the buttonholes are sewn through. You can see that there as well. You can see the draw cord runs through an eyelet here and an eyelet on this side, and then it can be run through the buttonhole there. So it's actually tied off behind the flap at the front here, which keeps the knot out of the way and nice and neat. So that's a detail there. You can see the pockets attached here and the lower pockets attached here. I can't see any evidence of these having had the nylon loops in them. I can't see any detail on the back here of the stitching where the nylon loops would have been removed, so that's a detail to mention here. We'll start moving this around now and have a look at some other details of the construction. Looking at the right hand side here, you can see the shoulder seam running down here, the arm attached on here, and then we have the seam running down the side here from the sleeve. So the sleeve is constructed in the same way as well, and just details of the construction to see there. Basically, you can see we have the cuff double back on itself there to produce the cuff band, and the slot there in the cuff where these open up so they can be rolled up. And you can see details of the construction there, as I say. We'll move this around now and have a look at the back. Looking at the back here, you can see the stitching here where we have the yoke across the shoulders. You can also see the stitching here where this has been drawn in at the waist, and we have the channel for the draw cord running around there, as you can see, and also down at the bottom here. You can see the draw cord channel there as well. That's the details of the back. We won't bother looking at the left-hand side. That's basically a mirror image of what we've seen on the right. That's a look at the internal details of this. So I hope you found it interesting looking at this. As said at the start of the video, I do think it's a shame Canada didn't introduce this for general issue. It's a good combination of Canada's existing combat uniform in a good camouflage print, and it would have meant, of course, that Canada had a general issue camouflage uniform for the 1980s. And in the end, of course, it took quite a bit longer for a general issue camouflage uniform to be introduced. So a shame it wasn't introduced. Now we're collecting curiosity, of course, and it's very nice to have this, and a big thank you again to Crispian for sending this over to me. It's wonderful. The search is now on for a pair of trousers to go with this, but having it here is great. We can display it on the torso mannequin as we have here, and this will at some point show up with some equipment and so forth in a proper display on the mannequin. But hopefully it's been interesting running through this today, looking at the internal details as well. If you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below, and that will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as I always say, a huge thank you, a massive thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It really is greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address in the description as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.